That Triathlon Show 364. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode I interview sports psychologist Stuart Holliday about psychology in triathlon and endurance sports. We go through various tools and techniques that can be helpful in different scenarios, and we discuss a few common situations where sports psychology can be particularly helpful, and plenty of other bits and pieces relating to sports psychology. But before we get into this interview, a big thanks to our sponsors, Roka. Roka produces exceptional quality triathlon wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, performance sunglasses, and prescription eyeglasses and sunglasses. If you want to go faster in the water, and then look to Roka's range of wetsuits, from the entry level to the top of the line wetsuits, all of them come with arms-up technology and exceptional quality and comfort in the water. Roka's tri-suits work perfectly together with the wetsuits, as they too come with arms-up technology to really maximize your shoulder mobility for the swim, and on the bike and run they are optimized for aerodynamics and comfort. Roka's range of sunglasses and prescription glasses is also packed with innovation with patented technologies such as Geeko anti-slip technology. They are ultralight and they have excellent optical properties. Visit roka.com/TTS for 20% off your order. And thank you to ZEN8. The ZEN8 Indoor Swim Trainer is a unique Dryland Swim Trainer that allows you to improve technique, power, and swim training consistency. It is a perfect tool to complement your pool and open water swimming, as it allows you to do very specific power and technique work, including working on your catch and your core activation, and it makes it easier to stay consistent even when you can't go to the pool. You can even use it to do activation work before a pool or open water swim, or you can do swim, bike, brick workouts more easily. You can try the ZEN8 risk-free for up to 30 days, so if you don't love it, just send it back. And you can get a special TTS bundle including the swim bench and a bunch of ZEN8 training plans and on-demand workouts on zen8swimtrainer.com/TTS. Now without any further ado, here's my interview with Stuart Holliday. Welcome to That Triathlon Show, Stu. How are you doing?
I'm very well, Mikhail. Nice to be with you today, and thanks for having me along.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Can you start by giving an introduction to the audience? Tell us more about who you are.
Okay, so thanks a lot. Yeah, I'm a sport and performance psychologist, and I've been doing this kind of work for about 10 years. Before that, I worked within business, had a career out of university with that for about 10 years. And when I started in the sports psychology world, I was working for Professor Steve Peters, who's most famous probably for the Chimp Paradox book, which a lot of athletes use in being able to understand their mind, what's going on inside their head, and be able to control their emotions in performance. Made famous by the likes of Sir Chris Hoy and Ronnie O'Sullivan, the snooker player. I was lucky enough to work in Olympic sports, so I was covering the archery Olympic team for up to the Rio Olympic Games. I also worked for British Paralympic Swimming for that cycle as well to Rio, and also the England Netball team. And in my last sort of big role working alongside Steve, I was at Liverpool Football Club in their academy. So I got a really broad range of different sports, individual and team, within the sports psychology realm. I did lots of hours and got lots of insight, knowledge, and learning from there. I always was, in my own time, an endurance athlete. I love cycling, I love running, and participated in various events on that side. And then in 2017, set up as a solo practitioner with my own private practice. And I now work in the fields of sports still. So I still have some football work, but predominantly my focus is on endurance, where I've specialized. I've done research in the area. I'm writing a book on the psychology of running with a fellow professional. And I help athletes in triathlon and in running, like marathons and endurance sport of any kind, to be able to work on their mental fitness, if you want to put it in that language. So whilst people are training in their different disciplines, physically, I have athletes come and want to work with me who want to improve their mental game.
Yeah. And just out of curiosity, what led you to change from the business world to sports psychology in the first place?
So I did an undergrad psychology degree way back when. And when I came out at the end of it, there were quite a lot of people that I knew on my course who were really clear at 21, 22 that they wanted to work in the prison service, or they wanted to work in clinical psychology or possibly educational psychology. And I came out from doing the degree, which I really enjoyed, but I was like, I don't know what field within the discipline I want to go down. And I'm still young. I don't have to make that decision now. And if you're working with people in their minds, I knew you had to be really clear about the kind of work you wanted to do. I didn't want to kind of just go into a field for the sake of it. So I decided to go and do something completely different and work in business, get some knowledge and skills in that world. And I was lucky enough to get taken on a tech firm. And so I specialized for my first career in tech and in the business world, which I did enjoy, and it got me a really good foundation. And at the same time, I was beginning to be involved, like I was saying, in endurance sport. I took it up myself, and I found a real passion for it. And thinking back to my psychology and then actually participating in events, I could see for myself how important it played a role in how well someone performs. And I was helping out coaches at an athletics club, and I just decided that sport must be the area to go in. I did my research and ended up doing a master's back in 2008 and got great training, which led me down this path that I'm on now.
And what then made you, when did you say it was 2017, 2018, move from, let's say, the working with the federation or the Olympic teams and so on to setting up your own practice?
I got a lot of exposure and experience working in those fields. I had thought about going in front of the cycle. I even took to a couple of interviews. But when you work in that world, it is a huge undertaking. You are away a lot with squads. It's very time intensive, very energy intensive, and I wasn't getting any younger. And just the opportunity came up, and this is what I wanted to go and do. And thanks to having quite a few ongoing private clients, I was able to just get started. And I also hadn't fully finished what's called chartership in the British process of becoming a sports psychologist. Yeah, I had all these hours under my belt. So I wanted to be able to go away and study and delve into getting behind the learning and getting into some of the theory and really, really understanding my knowledge even more, having done applied work, and combine that. So I was able to set up practice, work, and get that chartership about 4 years ago now. And just gives me a really great access and understanding. So it's sort of like you see people in different fields, law, accountancy, MBAs. It's kind of being able to take your practice to that level, I guess you could look at it. And ultimately, I love working with athletes. I like working with people in sport, coaches like yourself. And it's still a really underknown and underrepresented kind of part of performance, yet simultaneously everyone says it's so important. So for me, I think there's a long, long way to go with the incorporation into endurance sport in particular. There's not many people I know in this world who are doing what I'm doing. And yet when I bump into athletes at all levels, and often if you say that, one, you're a sports psychologist, and two, this is the area you're interested in, you will have your brains picked.
Yeah.
And
that's what I'll try to do today.
Exactly. I was about to say, you've kind of got me on here, and I guess for you, there's an element of your own curiosity, but equally you've got a listenership who, if you do triathlon, you are seriously dedicated to your sport. If you're not swimming, you're running. If you're not running, you're cycling, and then go back, rinse, repeat. And it's very exhausting. It's very tiring, but people are highly motivated. They really want to push themselves. And that for me, if we get to the crux of why I love doing what I do, is some people say to me, "Oh, do you help motivate athletes?" And the truth is, I don't need to, because yourself, if you're meeting someone who's done one or two triathlon competitions and they want to do more, you don't need to put motivation in them. It's there already.
Yeah, no, that's true. So, I mean, obviously, there's a lot of things that we can and will go into during today's interview. But what I will start with here is just ask you to, if you can list some of the most important tools in what I have termed here your mental training toolbox. I don't know if you have a better way of a better term to use, but yeah, can you discuss some of the strategies that you help your clients with when it comes to, as you said, the mental fitness part of their triathlon performance or endurance sports performance?
Sure. So I guess maybe just to kind of give a slight nuance flavor to how it is to work with a sports psychologist. Part and parcel of what people will come through the door with will be exactly what you've just asked for. Can you give me some specific help with a specific thing in my discipline, in my competition? And more than happy to go down that route. And obviously, like I was just saying there about that experience, the research angle, and the applied work I've done across different sports, these things are really important, and I think everyone can get better at them. And the work that I do is helping understand the athlete in front of me, their particular makeup, their particular needs, and give them what tools in that toolbox fit. But also there is an element where I guess the first part of it is when you look at an athlete in whatever sport, some people can go and do that discipline and they don't have to exert much mental energy to it, because maybe they've got a really strong mental game already. It's almost like they don't want or need to think about it because they're doing a great job already. People, in say strength and conditioning, you might have someone whose ability and strength through just their genetics and how they condition themselves, they don't need to go to a strength and conditioning coach and get a lot done because they've got that side of their work already well locked down and they're kind of almost doing it on autopilot. So it's not necessarily for every person, and that's fine. And then most people, though, can benefit from attending to whatever's going on inside their mind. And I think there's a crucial piece, the nuance piece that I'm trying to allude to is, I'm not saying you have to work with a professional in order to get the understanding and insight into how the mind works, but you need to kind of take a little bit of a step back first and build some self-awareness and take some time to work out what is it where I'm maybe particularly strong in my mental game. Some people, for instance, really struggle with how they feel before a competition. Other athletes really struggle in the heat of battle when they're kind of beginning to tire and their head drops a little bit and they can't lift themselves back up. Other people sometimes really struggle with injury and how that mentally hits them. So you've got to kind of really understand what your best skills are and maybe some of the areas for development. And I think that nearly everyone can benefit from one, understanding that, and then there are resources out there that you don't need to search too hard for. There are some great books, which if you're into endurance sport, for instance, you'd easily find without looking too hard about specifics.
Can you give some examples of great books that you would recommend?
Okay, so sometimes people feel I'll take one from the very top there. Some people feel that in the heat of battle, when it really comes to the crunch point, they don't have the tenacity to really go to that place of like the pain cave, or they can't push themselves hard and they want to. And if you look on Amazon or any endurance advice site, you'd see something like a book like How Bad Do You Want It by Matt Fitzgerald.
Yep.
That would be a great starting point. And the book almost tells you on the front cover what it's about and a method by which you can kind of begin to tease out how to push yourself into a dark place that we sometimes go in endurance sports. So I think if we try and take a shortcut without losing the audience, Mikhail, I'll say that the first thing before delving into the toolbox is more self-awareness. And you might think that that's a real obvious given, but it isn't, because we're not trained to think in this world that we live in, whether that's in our sport, in our work. It's something which I'm very passionate about. I think we could all improve from courses on like what's going on inside our minds, understanding about meta thinking about our thinking, and just learning about how our emotions work. What kind of person are you? Are you cool and calm, collected? Are you someone who can fly off the handle and have a bit of a temper on them? How do these kind of parts of your character help or maybe hinder you in your performance? But digging into some of the things which you've specifically asked about here on your question, like what are the things that people can maybe get better at and have in their toolbox? And I think when we stand back and look at, if we've already boxed off the understanding yourself part, if we just have that as a broad part to get you going, one of the key things is that I would always be starting a conversation with an athlete would be, okay, imagine you're in a race, imagine you're at a competition. What's it like? What's it like from that experience of being with you at that competition? If I could be inside your head, Mikhail, if you're doing a half Ironman, I'd be saying to you, what's it like to be inside your head? What's the conversation like when no one else is there, and what you're saying to yourself? Is what you're saying internally something that's really positive? Are you really fired up and excited to be there? Are you positive and we can do this in how you're talking to yourself? Is it like you've got a little coach inside you that's like cheering you on? Or like a lot of athletes, when it starts to get hard, or maybe when there's fear, doubt, or maybe comparison to the other competitors, is what you're saying to yourself maybe a bit more negative? Is it a bit more unfair to yourself potentially, or not helpful? You know, people can go really negative in a race. You look at, you know, like an Ironman competition where you're out on the course for 12 hours. Sure, the conversation inside any competitor's head's not going to be pretty and lovely the whole time. And what we're talking about here is the concepts in sports psychology of self-talk. And you don't want to be having like a personal commentator inside your head for 12 hours, because that will absolutely exhaust you in an Ironman competition. You need to be, it's a real pacing performance that you need to do across 12 hours, because you need to be able to effectively switch off and let your discipline take care of itself at times. And then there's other times where you need to be able to really switch on. And, you know, I'd imagine, say, when it's coming to transition zones, for instance, when you're leaving the swim to go to the bike, you know, you've got to really, you know, be very, very switched on to the shift in your body movements in the swim, going onto the land, being able to be really attentive and find where your bike is, have a process for your actual transition itself, and then like switching gears mentally as well as switching gears on your bike to get a really good start onto the bike phase of triathlon. That's just one example, for instance.
So when you talk about switching on and switching off here, is it are we still talking about the self-talk part of like switching on your self-talk and switching it off, or are you talking more in a general sense of switching on and switching off, like your attention, or what do you refer to?
I think that's I like the way that you phrased that, because it's both. So the first part of that is, you know, if you're in a really good rhythm and a really good place with your swim, if I was that inner coach inside your head, if I was hearing what the voice was saying, I just want to hear like kind of very low level noise about like being able to catch the water, to be able to, assuming that you're not like completely hemmed in with loads of other swimmers around you, that you were, you know, you've got a groove, you've got a rhythm, and you're just letting the swim happen. But then like if you're looking ahead and you're seeing that like it's not that far to being able to go to, say, the transition, then we might want that self-talk to be able to increase in order to be able to like talk yourself through up to and through and out of the transition phase. Again, you know, like having your own personal inner coach within you, being able to, there is a concept in psychology, which is kind of like talk instructional therapy. So sometimes where you have a very stressful or pressured situation, one way that you can get through it is almost to be commentating on what you're doing, which might sound quite robotic and very boring. But if you're looking to execute really, really well on a crucial part of your performance, maybe being a bit neutral and a bit bland is better than being over hyped and over emotional. So you've got the aspect that you're saying there, like, is the self-talk about kind of in nature of tone, but also what we're trying to do is kind of make it somewhat instructional, because if you imagine how your body must feel as you're going from, say, that phase of the performance onto the bike, your body and blood is all kind of all over the place, and your mind is the thing that's controlling your performance. So as well as talking yourself through it, then it's like about being able to give the actual motivational and instructional parts together, which will, if done well, will lead to a hopefully better performance. That's what the evidence tends to show. So I guess, does that answer your question on both parts?
Yeah, and you got it there at the very end with the motivational part of it, because I was going to ask if, because until then you talked a lot about the instructional part of it, which I think is something that a lot of people, myself included, maybe don't think about and maybe don't do really in races, like using self-talk in those moments of the race when you might need or might benefit from some kind of that inner coach, as you say, being quite instructional with how you go about, let's say, your transition or whatever specific point of the race that is quite critical and where you might benefit from that. But I think we tend to think a lot about the motivational part, but not about the instructional part.
And your question was, the second part was about the attentional process. And if you think about, say, this point that I keep coming back to, just a hypothetical transition in a really key race that you spent months training for. When we're under pressure, when we're feeling stress, and stress isn't all negative, stress is almost like the body's call to action from the brain. We have a narrow channel with which, almost through the mind, that we can give limited amounts of instruction. And, it's tiring. It can be very exhausting. You want to keep your instructional language very simple, very to the point, as positive and not emotionally kind of jumpy as is possible. And again, like I was suggesting, coming out and knowing where your kit and equipment. I know in triathlon, when I speak to triathletes, the kit is such an important part of it. It's like another aspect of the person's performance that they really put a lot of value on and see as important. And we need to not diminish that and say we acknowledge it. And okay, but like you just need to get from point A to point B as gracefully, both physically and mentally, as possible, and give yourself the best chance of a clean getaway. And that's what I'm saying about your attentional focus. And so one of the things that we talk quite a lot about, me and one of the people I work with closely in sports psychology, is about chunking. And obviously a triathlon, you have 3 chunks already in the swim, bike, run. But even within each of those, and we could even chunk it more if we can include the 2 transition zones. But equally, even within the different parts, you can chunk stuff down. And what I mean by that is, over the course of a certain kilometers distance of, say, cycling, you're not going to think, oh my God, I've got, this huge bike ride to do, or I've got the marathon, the 26.2 miles at the end of an Ironman to have to get through. You've got to break it down to more manageable pieces. And when things are going really tough, you need to be able to chunk down into even smaller packages, sometimes just to get yourself through a really difficult phase of your competition, from where you're running or cycling to here to a landmark in the distance, and just focusing purely on that little part to sort of help build up your navigation through a really difficult mental and physical part of the competition.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and that is something that I find personally I have used a lot and recommended to my athletes use, for example, breaking up the run into, let's say, 4 equally long segments. That can work quite well, because actually a lot of races have 4 laps on the run, like where it's 4 times 5 point something kilometers for a half marathon, or 10.5 kilometers for a marathon. So that kind of, but also it depends on the speed of the athlete. I find if it's a slower athlete, then breaking it up into something that will take them a lesser duration than, let's say, 10.5 kilometers. It can even be aid station to aid station, and take it one aid station at a time. But as you say, it makes sense as well that when you get further into the race and it starts to get really tough, you might break it down into smaller pieces than you did before when you were feeling good. I want to ask about some other tools as well before we get into some specific scenarios. But do you talk with your clients a lot about goal setting? How does that play into sports psychology and the work that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. Both in training and for the thing that you're training for. So within, you might set yourself at the beginning an outcome goal of, I want to do an Ironman in less than 12 hours or something like that. 10 hours, whatever. You've got to kind of have the big prize that's going to get you excited, because you're going to have to dedicate so much of your time to train for it. And that would be something that you work with a coach, and maybe first timers just want to say, I want to go and get round. I want to complete the triathlon, and ideally I want to have a great experience. If it's the first time, they'll hit a personal best, whether it's a really good fast time or a slower time, it makes no difference. Obviously, more experienced athletes, they're probably looking to make gains on previous performances. So then you look at your performance goal, which would be around maybe a time. Maybe you've got specifics that you want to improve on one leg of the triathlon journey. And you need to set goals both for the race itself and sort of get yourself excited with that, but they've got to be realistic. But you might not be in a place at the beginning of your training block to be able to know what that number looks like. You could maybe have a ballpark figure, but really it's like, okay, so in training as well, how do you set your goals for what's going to take quite a lot of time? And like we were saying about the chunking, how you can break that down and how you can stay motivated over the long term. And also, say something goes wrong in training, you get an injury, you've got to be able to have a flexible goal plan, but also you've got to also take your injury setback as an opportunity for learning, an opportunity for growth, and an opportunity to test your sports psychology. And where I've had really interesting conversations in the past year with a number of different athletes in different disciplines is treating injury is almost like a competition within itself. Inevitably, if you're pushing your body to its limits in training and competition in endurance sport, something's going to probably falter at some point. And how you choose to be psychologically is going to have a big impact on how you cope with it. Some people can go in a really dark place being injured because they don't like the fact they're injured, and it's put them off their main goal that they've set. So goal setting is a crucial piece. And I think also being able to know where, I said at the beginning, being aware of your psychological strengths is a really important part for me. Understanding goal strengths, you could be working toward, there's so many component parts within triathlon training. Which goals are going to get you excited for specific things? Because it could be you're really good in one area and you want to get better at it. That's one way you can set a goal. It could be you've really flunked out in one part of your discipline, and you go to your next triathlon and you're like, you know what, the one thing where I've got the Achilles heel, maybe it's the swim. I'm going to work with my coach. I'm going to work really hard at my swim phase because it's where I've got the greatest area for development.
If you summarize it real quick and briefly, what are the purposes or the purpose of having a goal? And let's say it's an outcome goal for a race, or which could be just completing the distance. But you mentioned already, like, it's going to get you motivated to do the training. But are there any other reasons why setting a goal is a good thing?
I love the old Bandura quote that you wouldn't just get in a cab and say to the driver, "Take me anywhere." Having a goal gives you, and your psyche is like a child almost. Like we all have different aspects to the identity of our characters, the parts of ourselves that we really, really like and think are great. Maybe some parts of our character which maybe aren't so pretty when we're under pressure and under stress in particular. And when you're setting a goal, it's talking to the different parts of your psyche. Like, so that kind of innocent child part of you that's like really, really excited. It's like, Mikhail, what if I offered you a personal best in a half Ironman? How much is that going to get you excited? And you're a triathlon nut, and you turn to me and say, "Stu, that's fantastic." It would be like, it would always be that kind of like kid part of you, which is talking and saying to me that you're really up for the fight and the challenge and like really full on. But there's also a bit more of maybe the mature, older Mikhail who's like, yeah, but that's going to take a lot of work. If I'm going to go quicker than I've ever gone before, the amount of work, the amount of training that needs to be there, the discipline and the maturity that I need as an athlete. And what you're doing is holding these two different parts of you and kind of ideally combining them so that you indulge both and perform at your best when it comes to race day.
And with regard to having goals during training, as you mentioned, can you give some examples of that? So let's say, for example, I'm going to do my first ever triathlon, a sprint distance triathlon. I just want to get around, but I haven't really done much swimming or biking. Maybe a little bit of running is a very typical background to get into triathlon. What obviously then I have the goal of completing the distance, which is a good motivating goal, I think. But what about setting goals for training? What would that look like in this specific scenario?
Well, I'm really keen on. I love doing baseline measurements with people. So it's like, okay, if you've never done this before, and you know that in a sprint triathlon you've got a 5K run, it's entirely possible you could do a 5K on its own, untrained, and just go out and see what time you get. If you just go, untrained, and you're not injured, and you've done all the care to be able to not do yourself damage, but go and try and post as quick a time. See what you get, and then whatever time you get from there, you can go and use a calculator online and say, well, my training speeds that I need to get better at my 5K are X, Y, and Z. And so if I've got 8 weeks to my sprint triathlon and I've done my test 5K and it was really hard physically and mentally, I've now got a baseline that I can more or less have a good idea about what I could do if I trained really well at that. And the same goes for the swim, the same goes for the bike. And then you can kind of, you've got something as a gauge to kind of go off. And that would be the initial part of the goal. And if you've had that baseline, you think, well, I want to get better. And, you've gone all out and you found that, towards the end, you were flagging and feeling really mentally challenged. You could also not just have a time-based goal, a performance goal, but you might say, you know what, in this training block, I want to work at my mentality so that when it gets really hard, I can work on some of these skills I heard that guy on that triathlon show podcast talk about. Maybe some of this self-talk. Maybe I can use some visualization. Maybe I can chunk a 5K run to make it that bit easier. And one of the things, whether it's an experienced or novice athlete, I do when I get them to work with me is to sort of set the mental side of your performance as a goal in itself. And, how can you, going into it, define where you're at, and what's going to be success on the mental side of your performance at the end. So again, it's breaking it down into smaller parts so that even if it's, your performance isn't really consistent or really top notch, you've got things which you can work on and feel positive about and be making small minor improvements at the very least.
And what would setting a goal for your mental performance look like? For you can use the same example here with training for your first sprint triathlon and having a 5K baseline run. What would be an example of setting a goal for your mental performance?
It would. I mean, I say to my athletes, like what kind of experience do you want? Let's pretend you finish your triathlon now. Yeah. So we've got this brain in our head that's got the capability of imagining a future that hasn't happened yet. When you finish this triathlon, do you want to feel like it's been an absolute slog and that mentally you've been wrestling with yourself all the way through it? Or do you want to accept that if you're going to put yourself in a endurance competition, it's going to be hard physically and mentally? How do you want that experience to be? How do you want to look back at both the race itself and beforehand your training block? And when you sit down with people and you have that conversation, and even if you didn't work with a psychologist, but you listen to this and take on board what I'm saying, you could sit there and write out, I want to be able to get round. I want to be able to enjoy the experience. I want to be able to look back at the fact that I completed all the training, ticked off all the sessions, that I pushed myself, that I had as good experience on the day when my head started to drop, that I had a psychological tool or skills that I've been practicing in my training that I was then able to try and use in the race to have a good experience and not fall down a negative spiral. These are these are things within our control if we take the time to think about it. So that might be one way that anyone could get started about it, thinking about the experience before it's actually happened, and then take that attitude into the training and racing.
And you mentioned before visualization. How and when and how would you use a tool like that?
Well, I mean, what I've just explained there is actually a visualization technique that we can use. Sit down for a moment and you might not know the course that you're about to go and do for your first ever triathlon, but that could be something for you to go and look at. Often with my athletes, I'll say, go online. You can see people record courses for races sometimes, so you could see what it looks like when you're there. So there's a literal visualization piece that you could do. Maybe you live near to where your first sprint may be, so you could go out in the car or on your bike or even on a walk and go and have a look at where it will be roughly. You could always look online at maps that competition organizers put out there. And you could literally just then spend some time thinking about what's it going to look like on the day? What's it going to look like when I'm whizzing along on my bike through this countryside or in this city? What's it going to look like when I'm running around this town centre? And then combining both what it would look like visually to you as you're doing it with, and how do I want to be thinking? A bit like what we were saying earlier about the self-talk. If I'm really tired and I'm flagging, how am I going to pull myself around to have that better conversation? What's it going to feel like when I'm at the end of this triathlon and I'm tired, I'm fatigued? How can I push through that? And when we visualize both with using all of our senses as much as possible, both our imagination, what it looks like, how it feels, and what it might sound like, because often if you're doing a triathlon, say in a city and there's a lot of people there, you're going to have a crowd, you're going to have cheering, you're going to have noise. So you've got to consider all these different elements, and you could begin to visualize the broader race sense, but equally on interval training, which you might do in the pool or on the bike or in the running, for instance. They're probably more smaller pieces of work where visualization can, again, be very helpful to break down and get through difficult parts of your training. Because when you're doing that short, sharp work, yes, you're not out on your feet for a long session, but it can be quite hard because you're pushing your body to its physical limits.
And how would you use visualization in a hard running interval session, for example?
Well, I mean, we know that in reality, at the start of a session, we're likely to feel a bit more fresh. We can not quite switch off, but be quite relaxed. And gradually the session is going to get harder. So then it's we'll think through before you go to the track, if you're doing, 6x800s or something like that. The first couple might be quite straightforward. And then, okay, what do I need to think about as the session goes on? Well, from a visualization point of view, how do I want to be if I'm coming up against the barrier of the pain, how am I going to get through it? And, you could break down into your visualization. Well, I'm imagining running around the track, and I can use the bends and the straights and the furniture of the running track as ways to make it easier to get around. It could be that I'm thinking about my running form, so I could see myself on the fourth or the fifth of those hard 800s. And because physically it's hard work, I can see myself collapsing, but I'm telling myself to lift my chest up, lift my head up, get my leg turnover going, use my arms. And in that way, that's where, both the visualization of how you should look with the verbalization of how you want to talk to yourself come together, and again provide you with something very strong, very tangible, which the more you do it in training, the more easy and accessible it is in the race situation. What you do in training, I'm sure as a triathlon coach, you say to your athletes, what you do in training consistently well will play out more likely in the race scenario. It's the same for the mental side of performance.
No, exactly. Yeah. The principle of specificity is something that I'm quite big on when it comes to training, and I'm sure that applies in psychology as well. The one thing we hear about visualization is to visualize different scenarios in a race. So let's say maybe you visualize having a flat tire, or maybe it raining on the day and you still being able to take the descents well on the bike, like that sort of thing. How do you think about those sorts of things? Like, do you just visualize a standard race video in your head, or do you recommend doing that kind of multiple scenarios, including overcoming obstacles, or how you deal with certain obstacles?
Well, I think first of all, we've got to live in the real world. A lot of the people who are listening to this are probably not pro athletes. They're people who are working hard, and they've got a really busy schedule. Maybe they've got things like families, or maybe a relative they might have to care for as well, or whatever your circumstance, and they're trying to fit triathlon training in, and they're hearing me and you talk and thinking, okay guys, that's really great, but in reality I've got such limited time, I don't know if I can fit in all this self-talk and all this visualization and all this chunking that they're talking about. I'd always encourage you to be thinking about that in your training. So what you can be doing is, rather than having to think too much about fitting this in on top of training, this is what you should be doing during training. And maybe you're doing a long run as part of your overall training, and you could be thinking about different visualizations for exactly the situation Mikhail gave. One, I'd say you just want to, if you've never done this kind of work before, it's worth trying to take some time to do it going well and understanding what the visualization is, like I was describing, for a difficult track session or a difficult swim set, for instance. But if you've got the time of a long triathlon training, definitely maybe in taper, that's a good time to think about thinking about the what ifs. And I always try and work with my athletes, if I'm doing close one-to-one work, of doing what if scenario planning, exactly like what you're saying. What would you do if your bike gets a flat? And you, without going into like using the language or being too clever, what would be the first thing you'd do? And the athlete might go, well, I'd really imagine that in a scenario where I've got a flat tire, I'd be freaking out a bit, going, oh my God, what the hell? So the first thing I need to do is, maybe before even fixing the tire, is having a conversation with myself and getting myself in a calm place. Because if I'm panicking and overly worrying and stressing about it, I'm going to be flapping at getting the tire fixed, and that's going to actually add on more time, because changing the inner tube on it's going to take longer, and it's going to take me longer to get back on the bike and back out on the course. So the first thing I need to practice is seeing myself having a flat tire, having a calm attitude, and then like visualizing how I'm going to change the tire, and that I'm going to do it as quickly as possible, but without doing it in a flapping and stressed state. And if you invest that time on a scenario such as that, what we know from the science is that it's likely that if that happened to you on race day, you've kind of mentally been there already, and you're going to say to yourself, first things, we've got a flat, don't panic, we've got to deal with this situation with what's in front of us. this is how we're going to go about it. So it's like, it is mental rehearsal. That's what it's sometimes called. So rehearsing for the what ifs is definitely a good plan, but probably I'd say only once you've kind of got through the initial part of having done some visualization of things going well. So that's kind of the caveat I'd give there.
Yeah, that's useful. And well, the final tool I want to ask about is mindfulness, meditation, things like that. Is that something that you use or recommend?
Yeah, I mean, I think that where this can come in really helpful is what we're saying about the nature of the sport. I mean, for some people, meditation is it's something that they know they could do and that they like, but the thing I hear often is either one, I don't have the time to do it, or two, I've tried it and it's so hard, I can't clear my mind because I'm so busy with my life, my work, my triathlon, running, whatever. So what I'd say to that is understandable. It's not for everyone. You can be mindful in your running and your long cycling and maybe on your long swim sets. Certainly where swimming goes, I'm not a great swimmer, but the swimmers I know who have done the miles, when they talk about following the black line down the pool, when they're doing their sets, you're effectively in a mindful state already. So that would be a fantastic place whilst you're actually doing your training to just be thinking about enjoying the fact you're swimming in the pool. Yeah, sometimes a long swim session where it's just long and slow can be quite boring. Tune into your body, tune into the pool, and it can be you might be working hard, but it could be quite a relaxing state. Similarly, if you're doing a long run on a Saturday or a Sunday and you're out in nature, and you've worked really hard in the week, you've done the really hard work and channeled all that mental energy into those sessions. We want you to just do a long, slow run, relax your mind, because we know from the science of sport, if you just hammer and tongs doing all your training and overthinking, mentally you're fatiguing, physically you're fatiguing. So just being able to switch off is incredibly helpful. And again, in those moments where you're trying to get your sleep in, because sleep's where the recovery from all the good work you've done in your training has happened. I'm a really big fan of yoga nidra and non-sleep active deep rest, I think it's called. If you look in the work of Andrew Huberman, there's some great stuff on YouTube. And yoga nidra is like for people who don't want to meditate or can't meditate, it's a great thing. It's effectively a body scan, and you put it either on your phone or your headphones, and it's someone talking to you, getting you to focus on the different parts of your body. So they'll say, right, lay down, close your eyes, but don't go to sleep, and listen to what we've got to say. I want you to put your focus on your forehead, and then put your focus on your ears, then put your focus on your chin, and literally go around your body. And doing that exercise, you'll find if you do it for 10 minutes, your brain's active because you're doing something with it, but it's very relaxing because you're not thinking about, oh, that swim set went really badly, or, oh my God, my boss at work's been a jerk and I hate my work and I can't wait to leave. You're focused on relaxing, being calm. And if you want to do well, whether you're at the beginning part of your triathlon journey or you're a really experienced athlete, the recovery is just as important, if not more so, than all of the hard work you do in training. So meditation can particularly help in taper and in recovery parts of your journey if you're not doing it in the actual activity itself.
Who do you think is? You said it is not for everyone, but for whom do you think meditation could be a good idea? Is it people that just struggle to relax, maybe, as you say, struggle to go to sleep or something? What would you say? Who would be the likely candidate for benefiting from it?
I would say all hardworking triathletes.
Yeah.
If the thing is, it's like anything. We've talked today about self-talk, visualization, chunking, and now we've talked about mindfulness and relaxation methodologies. If you're a triathlete listening to this and you try all or some of these, and one or two of them stick, and you use them in your next training block or triathlon, fingers crossed you enjoy training with them, and two, you might end up using them within your discipline. And we know that when we look at people who start implementing at least some psychological skills successfully, they tend to have a better experience, and hopefully that translates in terms of performance as well. So I don't think it's not about being a type A personality needs this and, a calmer person doesn't. If you're working super hard, it's just about aiding recovery in my book.
Yeah. Great. So let's move on and talk about some scenarios. And I'm aware that you have a bit of a timeline, so we will try to keep that. But we spent some time with these tools, but I think it was great, and we got through a lot. But first of all, somebody dealing with pre-race anxiety, what would be the advice that you would typically give to that kind of athlete?
I mean, this is a great one, Mikhail. I'm glad you asked it, because we find that a lot of people get this, whether they're first-timers, really experienced participants. It's our body and mind's natural way of saying that something important and significant is coming up. As my old professor says, there's a reason why there's all those toilets next to the start line of big competitions, because through anxiety, we get a quickened heart rate. We find our pulse getting quicker. We find maybe our palms are sweating, and maybe we have the urge to poop more than normal. Not wanting to be too gross on your show, sorry. But these are normal. What we've got to understand is it's normal to feel heightened. And if anything, what the problem isn't that we're hyped up. It's just that the interpretation of being hyped up is problematic. And if you didn't have these feelings, then you might not perform as well. It's just how you interpret them and saying, actually, I've spent 3 months training. This is a big day. This matters to me, and I want to do well. And again, we talk about trusting the training, trust the process, channeling that feeling into something positive. Like, rather than it being, oh my God, I feel really nervous and anxious, you're saying, oh my God, my body is really full of adrenaline and it's ready to go. I need to be really aware not to go off really quickly when the gun goes, but this is a good feeling, and change your relationship with it. What I'd advise is, if you're doing a big training block, I mean, it'd be hard if you're just doing a super sprint or a sprint as your first thing, because you're just going to have to work at managing those feelings on the day. But if you're working towards a big competition, but you put yourself into smaller races or different things, you could practice what we're saying here in the smaller races. Do a little audit at the end. How well did I manage my pre-race adrenaline, not nerves? How did I manage my pre-race adrenaline? What worked really well? What would I do differently next time? And also, I'd say to yourself, when you have those feelings, which might feel a bit overwhelming near the beginning, how quickly did they disappear once you got into the race? Because what we find is once the gun goes, you've been swimming, doing a race activity for a few minutes, your heart rate goes down. You're not as hyped up for the whole event. So always have that in your mind. It's just body and mind's natural good response.
Yeah, I really liked the way you framed that with that it's the interpretation of what's going on that is the problem, not what is actually going on. So that's a good way of putting it, I think. And another scenario, we kind of talked about this a little bit, but if you have somebody who seems to struggle when they get to the crunch point of the race, whether it's that they're just getting to that point where fatigue really sets in a longer race, or perhaps some kind of obstacle comes up. But basically, when there are tough points in the race, they seem to struggle. How would you advise an athlete like that?
Well, again, we've touched on it earlier in our conversation today, and that's around like anticipating, first of all, that this could happen, and that again, it's quite normal that if you're pushing yourself wherever you are in the race pack, you're going to be feeling, if you're doing a good job, that it's bloody hard. And that, the more racing and training that you do where you're pushing yourself and you equip yourself with some tools to talk yourself through it. Think about that inner coach, that I talked about right back at the beginning. What would your inner coach say to you to encourage you? They'd support you. They'd be saying, come on, Mikhail, it is really hard, but you've come this far. push yourself, keep going, talk positive, stay positive. What can you do to make the experience better? Say you're on your bike and you're fatiguing. Think about, how is my body feeling? Do a little body scan of like all the different parts of your body and like how they feel. If they're okay, all right, what about your fueling and hydration? Are you on point with that? Do you need to top up on any of those areas? Think about your body position on the bike. Are you just too hunched up? Are you not relaxed enough? Is your cadence not where it should be? And like gives yourself some pointers. And if you're thinking about the instruction, if you're thinking about the little audit check, what you're not doing is like getting attached to, oh my God, I'm feeling really tired. I feel awful. I feel like I want to quit. You've got to train your mind towards more helpful ways of thinking that are going to help performance. And, you could try it once and it doesn't quite work. And like your mind is still racing. And then you might instead like think, okay, well, what I might do I've tried the body scan here and I feel like I'm hydrated enough, but it's still really hurting. I'm going to chunk from that lamppost to the tree in the distance and just get from that point to that point, and then we'll see where we are. And then you could keep going through those kind of tools.
Yeah, and one more scenario: if you have an athlete coming to you and they just really struggle with low self-confidence, they might be a really good athlete, but they just can't. They just don't see themselves that way. Like what advice would you give in that situation?
Well, I mean, without knowing the athlete themselves, it's hard because different people have different levels of confidence, high and low, for different reasons. So I think you need to usually the athlete needs to be a bit more fair on themselves, a bit more kinder in what they're doing, because they're usually, if you talk to them, I find they're working really hard. They're training a lot. They've got races coming up, and it's just what I'm saying there about the nature of the way they talk to themselves. It could be that some of that conversation is a bit broader than just how they feel about their racing and triathlon at the time. It could be that it's a bit deeper about them as a person and not feeling as good as like the other competitors that they're going to be racing against. And it's about being able to take the step back and think about what you're doing and think about what you're doing well. If you're training really hard and you're going in for races and you're doing the best that you can at that time for that event, you should be rewarding yourself and not like mentally beating yourself up. There's definitely areas of your triathlon where you could be getting better, and the same for every single competitor. There's no competitor out there who could not benefit from more, slightly improved training, slightly improved psychology, slightly improved strength and conditioning, or whatever it might be. But in the moment that you're in, how well are you doing? And like, give yourself the pat on the back, reward yourself. And what I often talk about is this concept of confidence is currency. So if you add up all the different little bits of things you're doing well, that's actually a pretty good, that 5 or 10 things. That's a good block of confidence you should have. And like, you could put that towards, making yourself feel better about your training, making yourself feel better about your triathlon, make yourself feel better about your upcoming competition. Keep accruing more and more confidence. And then when you look back in taper at like how far you've come and that you've ticked off every session, you're hitting some good paces, your coach might be happy with everything you've done, even if you're feeling a bit crappy about it. You should like actively try and add those things up and like pat yourself on the back to give yourself the best chance of allowing yourself to perform as well as possible come race day.
How much do you think that comparison to others plays a role when it comes to self-confidence? Like, for example, I think it's quite normal the way I see it, that let's say we take a swim squad, you're in lane 4, the slowest lane, and then you work hard and you manage to get faster, you move up to lane 3, and instead of being happy with how much quicker you are than you used to be, instead of just comparing yourself to the people in level 3, now you compare yourself to the people in level 2, and you're just as unhappy because you still have another level to move up. But then the problem is, of course, there's always another level. Even for almost every single athlete in the world, there's another level that you can get to. At least one athlete who is faster than you in the world, and you're always looking up and comparing to others rather than comparing to yourself, let's say a month ago or a year ago.
I did actually work with a triathlete who had this very problem in his past, and he was reading some philosophy piece about comparison is the thief of joy, and he had done triathlons and was going into a half Ironman that he and his friends were going to be taking part in. He knew he was the slowest of the group of three, but he was like, look, I'm going to be putting more of myself into this training. I'm going to make it more self-referenced, more self-focused, and I'm going to get better. And when my brain goes to start comparing to others, I'm just going to have that mantra: comparison is the thief of joy. And I just be going back over my, he had his Training Peaks data and his Garmin data, and he was like, look out, if he'd tell himself to look at that and see how better he was doing than he had ever done before. And it's hard because it is, by its nature, you're in a competition and you want to beat the people, but you can only perform to the best of your trained ability on the day. You can't like quantum leap to the top of the tree if your body and mind aren't trained to that level. So it's about getting comfortable with what you've got and maximizing that on race day. And I think that's a good starting point at the very least.
Yeah, 100% agree. Like that's actually one of my pet peeves. I was watching a race the other weekend and a triathlon, and one of the commentators said when he was getting to the final part of the race, and there were a couple of athletes in the running, and they said that now it just comes down to who wants it more. But when you know this athlete, you know that one athlete is clearly the slightly but still superior athlete to the other. So it's not really about who wants it more. Like there's one athlete that is physically at just a little bit of a higher level. So, and of course that athlete ended up winning. I think that sometimes we use the how bad do you want it as a crutch. Like it's not, of course, like your physical ability is going to put a ceiling on what you can achieve, and then your mental ability can help you reach that ceiling, basically. Or do you see it that way?
Yeah, if you can maximize your performance on the day and you've given yourself all the training and the opportunity, you've got to look at the success at that and then use that as a platform for maybe next time.
Yeah. Some other general questions. What do you think? I think you also mentioned a little bit about this at the beginning. But if you don't have any like specific issues, like you don't have pre-race anxiety or you don't suffer from low self-confidence, can sports psychology still, like how does sports psychology still play into how you can become better as an athlete?
It's like what I said right at the back at the beginning that like strength and conditioning, with a little bit of analysis, you'll find areas that you can get better at. Maybe it's training mentality, maybe it's race mentality, and it's just about putting. I don't think I've ever met an athlete who doesn't really acknowledge the power of the mind to improve how they perform, whatever that looks like, and whether or not it's working with a professional or using some self-help book guides or online help. There's definitely areas where everyone can get better. You might go, well, you're a sports psych and it's your business, so of course you're going to say that. But a strength coach would probably say, well, most athletes could improve their glute strength, their hamstrings or whatever, or any part of it. And I'm just very aware that you've only got so many hours in the day as an athlete. I just always work on the adage, do what you can, and even a little bit of it is better than nothing at all. Giving it a chance.
And are there any things that you measure within sports psychology? Can you make it objective in any way, like whether an athlete is improving, or is it more based on more subjective feedback from the athlete? Of course, you can objectively measure performance in training and racing, but are there any kind of parameters that can be measured in sports psychology?
If we're looking for like a 1 rep max equivalent, I think we're going to struggle.
Yeah.
What I'd like to do with my athletes is, like, as quickly as we can when we work together, is to share their training schedule online, and then add in some psych elements to their training log, because I find a lot of athletes, particularly say triathletes, are very data driven and very mechanical and physical focus. And maybe if you are a super competitive athlete and maybe you're a bit cynical about the kind of work I do, fine, take what I say with a pinch of salt and take from it whatever you want. And if it's not for you, that's I've got no ego about it. But if you can, if you think about these psych skills, they're ones that if you work out a little bit more, you could gain that edge over your competitor. And if you're very outcome driven like that, by all means, whatever motivates you. But I like to sort of get people to look at their training plan and keep some kind of log of how do you rate your performance across all the different sessions you've done. And you could have a really bad session which maybe you cut short because it's the right thing to do because something twinges, but you could still give yourself a high mark for that session because you showed up and you did everything to the best of your ability and you made a sensible, wise athlete decision. You add up all those scores at the end of your training block, and that should give you something more tangible where you can be like, oh my God, I've done really well on both how I was thinking during my training and how I rated myself. You talked about how do you improve your self-confidence. There's one way, but also putting some more rich detail into your training other than smashed 6x800. Okay, well, why was that so good? If you smashed it, there's probably a psych element where you won the mental battle of the track that night. What was it that helped you win that mental battle? Put that in your training notes, and then when you go through it in taper, you're going to build so much confidence from looking back and knowing, oh, I used that in that part of my training. I used that in that part of my training, and you've got that competitive advantage.
Yeah. And can you describe what it's like working with a sports psychologist, whether it's you or somebody else? Is this something that is typically a weekly session or bi-weekly? And what is the number and frequency of sessions, that kind of thing, just to give an idea of what it's like?
So when I've worked with people in the past year, in particular in endurance sport, I've really tried to be saying to people, the best way to do this is maybe we meet just as you're going into a training block and we do a bit of an audit and find your strengths. What are your super strengths? What are the areas for development? What are you trying to achieve in this particular event? And where I've shifted with my work is just setting a number of sessions that we would do. Typically, we're looking at something like 12 or one a week, one every 10 days over the course of your training block. If you've never done this, so I've got high-end people who've never done sports psychology. I've got beginners who've never done it. But often those people who do so much to try or marathons or whatever, they've got a really good skill base already, but they just don't know it. And then it's bringing attention to where they're good. And then you could be working on this area, and having the accountability is where people feel like it adds value, because they might have a coach already, but then when they've got a psych as well, then it's they can talk about other things outside of the sport, which might be problematic because you could be doing all the right things in your training, but if life's a bit chaotic out of your sport, then that's not going to help your recovery in order to help your performance. So sometimes people want a little bit of that as well. But yeah, it could be that it's a longer engagement like that. Sometimes I have athletes who are really, really good, and they've got one specific thing where they've got a particular problem, and we could maybe go over it in 1 or 2 sessions. They're very rare. I did work with someone in the last 3 or 4 months, who came and we did 2 sessions for a particular event, and we just absolutely, they knew what they wanted. We got straight down to business for that particular thing, and that worked. But generally, a slightly longer engagement is better, because then they see the journey, and it just helps build that confidence over the cycle. So when they get to their race, they're just pumped and ready and can't wait to go.
Just out of curiosity, without revealing details about who it was or what the event was, but what was that particular thing? To give an example of what a small detail like that can be?
So this guy in particular that came to me, he had a problem about, like, he was very fast, and he knew that if he was going to go and achieve his target time, that he would have to go to a potentially mental place that he had never gone to before and push and have some specific tools to help him through that, some of which we touched on earlier in our conversation. But he's like, that's my problem. Everything else in my performance, I've got all sorted. I don't need any help with, but can you help me with that? And it's like, right. And he was so fired up because he was so specific. We had 2 sessions and he did get a 7-second PB. So I'm not saying it's all me, but we helped him get through a bit of a mental barrier that he was trying to get through.
Brilliant. And for those listeners that are interested in this topic, but for whatever reason they can't start working with a sports psychologist, you mentioned already How Bad Do You Want It as a book that can help. Or do you have any other books or resources that you would mention for listeners?
Okay, so I've just interviewed Matt Fitzgerald for my podcast, and he does a great book called Comeback Quotient, which has quite a big triathlon angle because he was training for an Ironman, and so for triathletes they'll be quite interested in that. And he was having to struggle through an injury rehab process with that, so that might talk to you. In terms of other books, as I said, I'd worked for Steve Peters for 4 or 5 years before I set my own consultancy up. The Chimp Paradox is really good. Athletes can really get their head around the concept of the chimp and the human and the model for their racing. It's not a sports specific book, but you can join the dots if you're pretty smart without being like, it's straightforward. It's not complex. And when I've worked with athletes, they like that concept because they can understand where that part of their psyche's impacting their performance.
Yeah. And if you can summarize this discussion or leave the listeners with 1 to 3 key takeaways, what would those be?
Wow, that is a seriously tough question. But I'll go right back to the beginning here, that a self-aware athlete is gonna probably be worth their weight in gold at whatever level, because they've got an honesty about, one, that drive to get better, but also a willingness to expose their vulnerabilities and frailties that they need to work on. And I'd say just taking a bit, people just in an endurance sport, I see quite a lot of people blindly signing up for one competition, then the next, then the next, then the next. And they're not really learning from where things have gone well and where things haven't so much between competitions. And they still want to get better. So it's like, well, have you taken the time to stop and work out what hasn't gone so well in a previous race, whether that's something physical or mechanical, psychological? If it is psychological, what was the thing or things that you found hard? But also, when you're doing a bit of self-awareness and analysis like that, be really fair to yourself, because sometimes when you ask people to do this, they'll just like, oh, I was crap here and I was awful here and I was terrible. But you've done really well. You've also got things which you've done really, really well. Maybe you just got to the start and you felt really good. You didn't have pre-race anxiety. Record that. So work out what your relative strengths and areas for development are, would be the first thing. Second thing, I'd probably go to, are you having good conversations with yourself in training and racing? Very basic. And that's talking to the self-talk piece. And very competitive athletes are the ones I find will often be the ones who say the harshest things to themselves, because they're pushing themselves so hard. They almost need to be a really tough critic. I'd say, could you tone down some of what you're saying and make it more helpful to performance? It doesn't need to be all rainbows and unicorns, but certainly, is what you're saying to yourself advantageous to what you're trying to achieve? So that'd be the second thing. And the third thing is, and this actually comes from Mr. Fitzgerald himself, is just things will go wrong in your event. don't panic. And he worked with the pros for one of his races where he trained with them as well. And he said the thing he noticed between pro level athletes and most people like us, Mikhail, who are, weekend warriors, excited amateurs, whatever you want to call us, is that the pros just don't sweat the small stuff so much. So like try and nurture a calmer way of thinking when it comes to your training. If a session doesn't go so well, it's disappointing, but get it in context and like make the next session better, but understand why the one you just did wasn't so bad. And, like for racing competition, put yourself in as good a place as possible before your race to give yourself the chance that you've trained for 3 months. And then during the race, if things go wrong, don't panic and just manage the situation to the best of your ability, because that's probably going to get you the time or nearer the time or the performance you want.
Yeah. And let's do the rapid fire questions. So take just one sentence to answer each of these. And the first one is, what's your favorite book or resource related to endurance sports or sports psychology?
I would say Run Like a Pro, even if you're slow, just to get an insight into how the pros train in every aspect of their sport.
Who's the author of that book?
Ben Rosario and Matt Fitzgerald.
Okay. And what's an important habit that you've benefited from athletically, professionally, or personally?
I think the one thing that I've experienced personally and I've seen in athletes where they've made the step up is owning your performance, like truly owning it and saying if a performance wasn't good enough, right, I'm going to really do it better next time. And I didn't do so well last time because it was on my shoulders and I'm going to make the change. That's got to be behind the improvement decision.
And finally, who's somebody that you look up to or that has inspired you?
In sport or just generally?
Just generally. No qualifier on that question.
Which person inspires me? I'm going to go a little left field for sports psychology. There's a practitioner who probably isn't known that well, but whose writing is very eloquent and interesting, and maybe a little bit more for the professional, as in not the professional athlete, but professional sports psychologist. But his books read really well, even for a lay reader. And that's a guy called Mark Anderson, who's Australian. And he's done various sports psychology books, some of which are for athletes and the public. I'll try and send over a link or two for your show notes, maybe, if that's going to help your listeners. But his writing is brilliant, and like he's done some stuff on anything from Buddhism within sport to sexuality, as well as high-end performance. And the way this guy thinks, I just really, really like, and it talks to the best part of performance for me.
Mm. And finally, Stu, tell us where can we follow you and find you online and on social media and so on?
Okay, so I have a podcast as well, like you. It's called the Focus Mind Podcast, and I have interviewed triathletes and triathlon coaches on there, as well as other endurance sport people in cycling and running, and people outside of those domains. So that's probably a good starting point. That's tied into my website, Focus Mind Coaching, which is focusmindcoaching.co.uk, 1S in focused. And you can find out about the kind of work that I do there on social media. Focus Mind Coaching on Instagram is probably the one channel that I use these days. I don't really go for Twitter and LinkedIn anymore.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much, Stu. It's been great to have a chat with you, and I hope to do it again another time.
Brilliant. And Mikhail, thanks for having such strong, helpful questions, which I hope your audience can take something from and use in their performance. Thanks for your time today.
I hope that you enjoyed that interview. As always, you can find the show notes on scientifictriathlon.com. I have a bunch of links there, the books that we talked about, but also a bunch of past episodes on this podcast relating to sports psychology, so you can go and have a look there. And of course, links to Focused Mind Coaching, which is Choose Practice, the website, the podcast, and the Instagram. Next Monday, I interview Andy Blow from Precision Fuel and Hydration, and he shares the exact numbers of carbohydrate, fluid, and sodium intake that pro athletes from Kona and 73 Worlds working with Precision Fuel and Hydration had. So it will be a unique insight into their strategy, and we get some key takeaways and tips for what we can learn about racing in those two very different sets of environmental conditions. If you want to improve your triathlon performance and want help to achieve your goals, then consider working with a scientific triathlon coach or training plan. Whether you're just getting into triathlon, trying to qualify for a world championship event, or even want to race professionally, we have experience in all of those scenarios and would love to discuss further around if and how we can help you on your triathlon journey. Find out more and contact us on scientifictriathlon.com, and we can discuss your specific goals and needs and see what's best for you. Finally, big thanks to our sponsors, Roka, that you can find on roka.com. Check out their wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, and exceptional sunglasses and prescription glasses for everything from day-to-day wear to extreme action sports. Use the promo code that you can get on roka.com/TTS to get 20% off your entire Roka order. And thank you to ZEN8. Use the ZEN8 Swim Trainer to improve your technique, power, stamina, and swim training consistency. Try the ZEN8 risk-free for up to 30 days and get the special TTS bundle including the Swim Trainer and a number of ZEN8 training plans and on-demand workouts on ZEN8swimtrainer.com/TTS. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.